Check that you have all of your panels, your back, your front, your sleeve facing, some strips for your ribbons, and then your collar. One is interfaced and one is not. Your skirt panels as well and your slit opening. Let's begin with our ribbons first. Fold it into half lengthwise and sew right in the center. So I've done a couple and I'm going to show you how to make that. So I've already sewn it right in the center. Grabbing my scissors, I'm going to trim the seam allowances so that they become half the size. So trim your seam allowances to remove half away. Make sure that the remaining seam allowance is smaller than the seam. I'm using a loop turner here, inserting it at one end and hooking a little bit of fabric at the other. Carefully, I'm going to turn it inside out. There we have it. We're going to move on to our modesty panel, right sides together, sewing them 1 cm seam allowance from here all the way to here. When you're done, grab a pair of scissors and trim at the curves. We're going to remove half of the seam allowance. Turn it inside out and iron. For the collar, one side has interfacing, one side doesn't. I'm going to sew along the curves. Wrong sides together, baste along the side from here to here. With the interface side facing up, grab an appropriate length of bias tape. Spread open the bias tape and sew in the crease. You're matching the edge of the bias tape to the edge of the fabric, moving along the curve as we go, but you're sewing in the crease, closest to the edge of the fabric. That would be approximately 0.5 cm from the edge. Just check that you are sewing at the correct crease and that your edges are all matching up. Push up the bias tape, wrap it around the edge and iron it flat. Iron it well so it stays in place. This is the back. I've ironed it so it stays flat. It will make your sewing a lot easier. Sew in the crease or on the bias tape. Sew up your darts on all your panels, the top and the skirt. Let's start on our front panel. Cut an appropriate length of bias tape. Position the bias tape so that it's right at the edge of the fabric. Sew on the bias tape close to the edge. Do the same for the bottom panel. Align it up to the edge and sew on the bias tape. Add your ribbons according to the notches on the paper pattern. I'm using 8 here. Make sure they are pointing in the same direction. We're going to baste it down close to the edge. Just secure the ribbon close to the edge. Let's join the modesty panel to the top front panel. My ribbons are already basted in place. With right sides together, sew them with a 1 cm seam allowance. Let's sew our facing on. Right sides together, sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. Now that this is done, we're going to understitch on the facing. Spread open and understitch on the facing, so that when you're done, you'll fold it this way and it will stay in place. When you're done, the top front panel is attached to the modesty panel and the bottom panel is attached to the facing. Grab your back panel, sew them up at the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. We're going to join the collar to the neckline. With the side with the interfacing, down on the panel, facing down, match up the bias tapes. Look for the notch indicating the shoulder joint. Same on the other side. Match the notches to the shoulder seam and all the way to the other side. 1 cm seam allowance. Check that the bias tapes are matched up. That will look very nice. Same on the other side. Let's start on the skirt panel. Now there is an opening for the slit. Let's join the top up first with a 1 cm seam allowance, stopping exactly at the notch. Grab a pair of scissors and make a slit in the seam allowance right where your stitches stop. Open up where the slit is so that it becomes a straight line. Grab an appropriate length of bias tape. Align the bias tape to the edge, spread open the bias tape and sew in the crease. Align it like this, flip open the bias tape and sew in the crease. Fold the bias tape so that it wraps the edge of the fabric, like so, and iron flat. Sew on the bias tape to seal it shut. For the skirt modesty panel, fold up the hem with 1 cm and sew down. Position your skirt modesty panel like so. It is intentionally slightly shorter than the skirt. Sew in the ditch where the bias tape meets the skirt, making sure to catch on the panel below. Let's join the top and the skirt together. With a 1 cm seam allowance, repeat for the back. Sew the sleeve into the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance. Match up your notches and your side seams. Sew up one side of the seam allowance, the less complicated side, with the 1.5 cm seam allowance. Now let's tackle the other side where the zip is about to go. Place the top part down, matching up the underarm and the sleeve. So from here to here with a 1.5 cm seam allowance, stopping right at the bias tape. Let's install the zip. From the top panel, you're going to start the zip just below the bias tape. Sew it down with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. After you've done so, match up the waist and sew the other side of the zip down. Now both sides of my zip are sewn up and they match exactly at the waist. Seal up the bottom of the zip. Now for the top part, we are going to open up the facing, and pull it down and sew on the outside of the zip. Open up the facing, fold it down and sew on the outside of the zip. When you're done, you turn it inside out and your zip will be very nicely wrapped. Do the same for the other side. For the other side, just cover this modesty panel down and sew on the outside of the zip. Hem up the sleeves, fold up 1.5 cm and sew with a 1 cm seam allowance from the edge. For the bottom of the skirt, same thing, fold it up 1.5 cm and sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. And your dress is completed.